From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I grew up here, and this is currently my community and my home. And therefore, it means a lot to me personally that we break this cycle of violence, diffuse attention, and build trust, showing the utmost respect for every interaction with every citizen.
24 hours ago, Ferguson, Missouri looked like a war zone as police cracked down on protest over the shooting death of Michael Brown. Now Missouri's governor has put the state highway patrol in charge of security. Tension is easing as the police put away their riot gear. We'll go to St. Louis to speak with a local pastor who was shot on Wednesday by a rubber bullet. We'll also speak to Radley Balco, author of Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of America's police forces. Then to Ebola in West Africa. 1,000 deaths? The World Health Organization says that number vastly underestimates the scale of the Ebola outbreak. We'll get an update on the latest and look at the debate over using experimental drugs to help halt the epidemic.
There was unanimous agreement among the experts that in the special circumstances of this Ebola outbreak, it is ethical to offer unregistered interventions as potential treatments or prevention. There are caveats, though. The panel said ethical criteria must always guide the provision of such intervention.
We'll speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist Laurie Garrett, global health law professor Lawrence Gostin of Georgetown, and medical anthropologist Adia Benton of Brown. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. More than 100 cities joined in a national moment of silence Thursday night to honor the memory of 18-year-old Michael Brown. The unarmed African-American teenager was shot to death by police Saturday in Ferguson, Missouri. Protests continued in Ferguson for a sixth night with a more festive mood after Missouri's Governor Jay Nixon put an African-American highway patrol captain named Ron Johnson in charge of security in the town of Ferguson. Johnson marched with protesters and ordered the riot gear put away. Protests also spread to Los Angeles, to Chicago, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, where Michael Brown's family attended a vigil, to New Orleans, Houston, and New York. In Miami, 8 people with the group Dream Defenders were arrested after refusing to leave a federal justice building. Ahmed Abouznaid said police brutality is a problem across the country.
It's related to what's happening in Ferguson. I think across the country we've seen police departments abuse their power, gun down innocent, unarmed people. It's happened in Ferguson. It's happened here in Miami with Israel Rifa Hernandez just a year ago.
Israel Hernandez was an 18-year-old graffiti artist who died a year ago last Sunday after police shocked him with a taser. The death of Michael Brown has coincided with other police killings of unarmed African-American men. On Tuesday in California, a father of 5 died in custody after sheriff's deputies repeatedly hit him with a taser. San Bernardino County sheriffs say they stopped Dante Parker while he was riding his bicycle after a resident reported seeing a man flee on a bike following a burglary attempt. Just 1 week earlier, police fatally shot 22-year-old John Crawford inside a Walmart in Beaver Creek, Ohio. Witnesses said Crawford was holding a toy gun on sale at the store and was shot after failing to put it down. Human Rights Watch says the killings of John Crawford, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner, who was placed in an illegal police chokehold by New York police, raised serious human rights concerns. President Obama is vowing to continue airstrikes aimed at protecting U.S. personnel in Iraq. Speaking Thursday, Obama said U.S. efforts have helped thousands of Yazidi minorities trapped on Mount Sinjar following the advance of rebels known as the Islamic State. Obama said humanitarian airdrops would likely end, but airstrikes will not.
We broke the ISIL siege of Mount Sinjar. We helped vulnerable people reach safety, and we helped save many innocent lives. We will continue airstrikes to protect our people and facilities in Iraq. We have increased the delivery of military assistance to Iraqi and Kurdish forces fighting ISIL on the front lines. And perhaps most importantly, we are urging Iraqis to come together to turn the tide against ISIL, above all by seizing the enormous opportunity of forming a new, inclusive government under the leadership of Prime Minister-designate Abadi.
European foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels today to discuss arming Iraqi Kurds against the Islamic State. Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has agreed to step down, easing the political crisis in Baghdad. Maliki's initial refusal to relinquish his post had raised fears of a coup. The United States has blocked a shipment of Hellfire missiles to Israel and tightened its approval process for future deals. According to the Wall Street Journal, the move came after officials at the White House and State Department discovered the Pentagon had supplied arms to Israel without their approval. Just hours after Israel's shelling of a UN school last month, the Pentagon confirmed it had resupplied Israeli ammunition. An unnamed diplomat told the Wall Street Journal officials were, quote, blindsided by the deal, although an unnamed defense official said it was handled properly. Britain has said it's prepared to suspend some arms exports to Israel if its assault on Gaza resumes. A new 5-day ceasefire began Thursday and appears to be holding. Israel's now facing an inquiry from a UN panel over possible war crimes committed during its siege of Gaza, which killed nearly 2,000 Palestinians, most of them civilian. 64 Israeli soldiers and 3 civilians in Israel were killed. On social media, Palestinians have been posting messages of solidarity and advice on how to deal with tear gas to protesters in Ferguson, Missouri. Amidst the ceasefire, 5 people were killed and several more wounded on Wednesday as Gaza's bomb disposal team dismantled an Israeli missile. The victims included 2 journalists with the Associated Press, Italian journalist Simone Camilli, who was killed, and Hatem Moussa, a Palestinian photographer from Gaza, who was seriously injured. AP President and CEO Gary Pruitt paid tribute to Camilli.
Simone was the first foreign journalist killed covering the Gaza war. He had worked with AP since 2005, when he was hired in Rome. He's well known and highly regarded throughout AP and highly regarded throughout the entire European media. He brought a unique ability to personalize his stories and portray the human drama in them with an incredible eye for detail.
Ukrainian officials have begun inspecting a Russian aid convoy bound for rebel-held cities in the east. Russia says the convoy contains humanitarian aid for areas under heavy assault by Ukrainian forces. But Ukraine says the convoy could be used as cover to sneak in military supplies to the pro-Russian rebels. 5 Muslim Americans have filed a lawsuit in federal court accusing the U.S. government of unjustly placing them on the terrorist watch list. One plaintiff in the suit, Yassin Kudura, says a federal official tried to pressure him into becoming a government informant in Libya, using removal from the no-fly list as an incentive. The Intercept news site revealed last month the Obama administration has expanded the watch list system by approving broad guidelines over who can be targeted. Hundreds of thousands of watch-listed individuals are recognized as having no ties to terrorist groups. Brazil's Socialist Party is expected to name a new candidate for president after the previous candidate, Eduardo Campos, died in a plane crash Wednesday. Campos had been running in 3rd place in opinion polls behind Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff and her top challenger, Aécio Neves. His likely replacement, Marina Silva, is a former rubber tapper who fought the devastation of the Amazon alongside Chico Mendes. Press freedom activists have delivered a petition with more than 125,000 signatures to the Justice Department in support of New York Times investigative journalist James Risen. Risen's risked possible prison time by refusing to divulge the source behind his expose on a failed CIA operation to deliver faulty nuclear bomb blueprints to Iran. Federal prosecutors believe the leak came from alleged CIA whistleblower Jeffrey Sterling, whose trial opens soon. Speaking in Washington, D.C. Thursday, Risen thanked his supporters and said he's seeking to defend the rights of future journalists.
There is just no way to conduct aggressive investigative reporting without a reporter's privilege of some kind, without confidential sources. And I don't believe you can have a democracy without aggressive investigative reporting and without freedom of the press.
And an Iranian-born mathematician has become the first woman to win math's highest honor. Stanford University professor Mariam Mirzakhani said in a statement she hopes her winning of the Fields Medal will encourage other young female scientists and mathematicians. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Protests are continuing in Ferguson, Missouri, over the death of Michael Brown, an unarmed African-American teenager who was shot by police on Saturday. But the mood in the town has changed drastically over the past 24 hours. On Wednesday night, Ferguson looked like a war zone as police fired tear gas, stun grenades, and smoke bombs. The police arrested at least 10 people, including a St. Louis alderman and 2 journalists. But last night, the mood was less tense after Missouri's Governor Jay Nixon put an African-American highway patrol captain named Ron Johnson in charge of security in the town. Johnson marched with protesters and ordered the riot gear put away.
I grew up here, and this is currently my community and my home. And therefore, it means a lot to me personally that we break this cycle of violence, diffuse attention, and build trust, showing the utmost respect for every interaction with every citizen. And when we talk about boots on the ground, my boots are going to be on the ground. And actually, I plan on tonight myself walking to the Quick Trip that has been called Ground Zero and meeting with the folks there myself tonight.
The events in Ferguson over the past week have sparked a national debate over racial profiling and the militarization of local police forces. On Thursday, President Obama addressed the situation in Ferguson but made no mention of race in his remarks.
There is never an excuse for violence against police or for those who would use this tragedy as a cover for vandalism or looting. There's also no excuse for police to use excessive force against peaceful protests or to throw protesters in jail for lawfully exercising their First Amendment rights. And here in the United States of America, police should not be bullying or arresting journalists who are just trying to do their jobs and report to the American people on what they see on the ground.
In a statement, Attorney General Eric Holder said, quote, "I'm deeply concerned that the deployment of military equipment and vehicles sends a conflicting message." What Holder didn't mention was the federal government's role in supplying local police forces with military-grade equipment. The New York Times reports Department of Homeland Security grant money paid for the $360,000 Bearcat armored truck on patrol in Ferguson. Most of the body armor worn by officers responding to the Ferguson protests was also paid for with federal money. Residents of Ferguson are still demanding answers about why police shot Michael Brown, the unarmed teenager, and why the police department has taken so long to release the name of the officer involved.
We don't want no private meetings going on. We're not here for no violence. But we're here to talk about what can happen to us as black people around the world. We want the world to know we're being done. We're asking for 100,000 people to come into the city of St. Louis to help us with the racism that they're doing. They are dogging us as black people. That's right. They're shooting us down the street like dogs, animals. They're shooting our babies. They're killing us for no reason other than we black. Our problem is not in Afghanistan. Make sure y'all selfish because they're not going to come all this. Our problem is not in Afghanistan. Our problem is not in Israel. Our problem ain't with Islamic Jihad. Our problem is in America with these racist white folks right here in America.
For more, we're joined by 2 guests in St. Louis. Patricia Bynes is Democratic Committee woman of Ferguson Township. She joined us Thursday to describe the police state she saw on the streets there. She tweeted Thursday that this seems like a completely different place. We're also joined by the Reverend Renita Lampkin, pastor of St. John African Methodist Episcopal Church in St. Louis, Missouri. She was hit with a rubber bullet by police on Wednesday during protests in Ferguson. And joining us via Democracy Now! Video stream is Radley Bacco, author of the book Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Forces. He's also a blogger for the Washington Post. Welcome all of you to Democracy Now! I'd like to begin first with Patricia Bynes. What has changed since in the last 24 hours in Ferguson?
Well, good morning, everybody. The change has been incredible. It feels like there's been a military occupation lifted off of the area. It's just been a complete change in spirit. The same people who were out protesting and who have been out in the streets were out. It was like a party last night. Everyone was relaxed, smiling, happy. For the most part, you know, there weren't too many issues. It was just amazing, and it happened in the same place where we were running from tear gas and trying to dodge rubber bullets and smoke bombs the exact night before.
Reverend Renita Brown, you were hit by a rubber bullet. When did that happen, and can you describe the situation?
It was Wednesday night, and the police told us to disperse or, you know, whatever would happen, and we didn't disperse. And so they sent out the tear gas, and people ran, and then we gathered a little bit further back, and they let us hang out there for a while. And then they told us to disperse again, and we didn't disperse. And they said, disperse so this will happen. And then they tear gassed, and some young guys didn't want to go still. So I was trying to get them to keep going. And then the rubber bullets came after the tear gas.
And Reverend Brown, why did you feel that you had to be out there with the crowd that night? And what was your reaction to this extreme crackdown by police, basically in military gear?
You have to be out there because that's where the people are. You have to be where the people are. And I thought that type of military type of policing is really, it's too much. It incited people.
You know,
when
Reverend,
it was just the...
When we hear that rubber bullets, among other things, are used, some people might think, well, they're rubber bullets, they're not live. Explain exactly the impact this rubber bullet had on you.
Well, left a pretty good red mark and a pretty nasty bruise, and it stings, and it's not comfortable. I don't recommend it.
This happened to you, they hit you in the stomach. How close were the police to you?
I don't know. They weren't close enough where I could actually see them through the fog. I don't know how close they were. I mean, it's pretty chaotic.
Patricia Bynes, I'd like to ask you, the press conferences that were held yesterday, first by the governor, who clearly was rebuking the local police, and certainly by sending in state troopers to take over the situation, was condemning the action that had occurred previously. And then, of course, President Obama himself, while measured in his tones, made it clear that there were violations that appeared to have occurred of people's right to protest and of the right of journalists to cover events. The impact that had on you as you heard of those statements by the governor and by the president.
Well, I think, to me, it felt like our concerns were being heard. I had several statewide elected officials call me personally and was asking, Patricia, what's going on? We know that you're down in the ground. And I was able to tell them exactly what was going on and how I did not think that things were going to get better if things continued at this route. So it's good to know that it was being heard. The governor needed to do something. Mm-hmm. There needed to be a serious intervention here because the tactics used it was just too much. And I am very glad that President Obama did come out and say something, because I think the images that the country saw, or even the world saw, about what was going on here in the St. Louis area were disturbing and could not be ignored anymore. This was just a physical manifestation of the hostility between the community at large, and it seems like the policing. It's not just a Ferguson incident, but just the issue of police harassment and police brutality and police tactics used on this community. That's what you saw the physical manifestation of.
Thursday, Congressman John Lewis, the well-known civil rights leader, appeared on MSNBC and compared the police response in Ferguson to what he experienced during the civil rights movement when he and others were attacked by police during peaceful protests.
It takes me back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and to have a city that a majority African-American and only 3 African-American on the police force, or to have local police officers referring to the protesters as animals, or to have people dressed in military garment and pointing rifles directly at the protesters. That is only going to excite people. So my own feeling is, right now, is that President Obama should use the authority of his office to declare martial law, federalize the Missouri National Guard to protect people as they protest. And people should come together reasonable elected officials, community leaders, and address what is happening there. If we fail to act, the fires of frustration and discontent will continue to burn, not only in federal Missouri, but all across America.
That was Congressmember John Lewis. Radley Balco is the author of the book Rise of the Warrior Cop, the Militarization of America's Police Forces. He also blogs for the Washington Post. He's speaking to us from Nashville. Talk about the level of militarization of this police department, what you saw as you watched the police for the first days of these protests.
Well, I mean, I think what we saw was a manifestation of a trend that's been going on for 30 to 35 years. It seemed particularly bad in Ferguson, but, a lot of what we saw in Ferguson was the St. Louis County Police Department sending in their SWAT teams and tactical teams to, I guess, what they would call preserve order in Ferguson. This has been happening, as I said, since about the early 1980s. The transfers from the Pentagon of surplus military equipment, we're talking tanks, armored personnel carriers, grenade launchers, helicopters, that began early in the Reagan administration informally, and then it was formalized by Congress in the 1990s. We've had literally millions of pieces of military equipment have been exchanged this way. And then after September 11th, the Department of Homeland Security started sending out checks to buy new military-grade equipment from companies that have now sprung up to build that equipment. So, what we're seeing in Ferguson, this is not a local issue, really. I mean, this is something that's been driven by national policies, by policies that, Congress has approved of and has oversight of and could end tomorrow if they wanted to.
And Radley Balco, I mean, I was struck not only by the assault weapons and the armored vehicles, but even by the officers changing their uniforms into military fatigues, as if they were going to war, rather than they were actually policing largely angry, peaceful protests. There was some looting, and there was some rock throwing and possible Molotov cocktails, but it really was not on a major scale from everything that I could tell. But yet they were loaded for war.
Right, and I think that, there are the obvious problems when we see the weapons, but the uniforms matter. When police officers are wearing camouflage, it sends a very clear message to the community that they're supposed to be serving. It also affects the mindset of the police officer himself. The idea that when we take domestic police officers and we train them like soldiers and we give them military gear and we dress them up like soldiers and we tell them they're fighting a war, war on crime or war on terror, they're going to start to see themselves as soldiers. And that's just a mindset that's not that really isn't appropriate for domestic policing. And I think you saw that in the way that they responded to protests, not just in Ferguson, but also, a lot of the crackdowns on the Occupy protesters, on the crackdowns at the political conventions over the years. I mean, this has become our default response to protest in the U.S., and it's something that's, I think, very antagonistic toward the very idea of free speech and the First Amendment.
Talk about, for example, this Bearcat armored personnel carrier, APC, and what it means, and snipers on top with guns.
Well, I've written a lot about the Bearcat. This is one of the new pieces of equipment that we have because of these DHS grants. And this is something that's made by a company called Lenco. And a few years ago, I wrote about a town in New Hampshire that sort of rebelled against this. Their town was going to buy a Bearcat with one of these DHS grants. And what I thought was fascinating was I interviewed somebody from the Lenco company and asked him about this. And he said, this is all overblown, that, if a Bearcat shows up on the scene, it's much more likely to be filled with crisis negotiators and psychiatrists than it is with, militarized cops. And I found a video that Lenco sends to police departments across the country to market the Bearcats. This is what they send them so that they'll want to buy a Bearcat with this DHS money. And the video shows camouflage-clad police officers, piled into the Bearcat. It shows up, they get out, they start shooting things. At one point, it pokes a hole into a building and injects tear gas. And it was all set to AC/DC's Thunderstruck. These are not images and sounds of crisis negotiators or de-escalation experts. This was all about militarism. This is all about conflict and aggression. And that's how the company markets this piece of equipment to police departments, which I think says a lot.
Well, on Thursday, Pentagon spokesperson Rear Admiral James Kirby defended the Pentagon's program of providing surplus equipment to domestic police forces. This is what he said.
There is a law enforcement support program that the Defense Department administers, which provides to law enforcement agencies around the country surplus military equipment, gear, arms, ammunition, vehicles. This is a useful program that allows for the reuse of military equipment that otherwise would be disposed of, that can be used, again, by law enforcement agencies to serve their citizens.
Radley Bacco, your response?
Well, look, I mean, this is a government federal agency whose their motto is from war fighter to crime fighter. So this, their very motto sort of betrays a misunderstanding of the role of soldiers versus the role of police officers. Right? These are two very different jobs. A soldier's job is to annihilate a foreign enemy. It's to kill people and break things. A police officer's job is to keep the peace and to protect our constitutional rights. And so, this agency, I think, really reveals that, with its very motto from its very start, that doesn't appreciate that difference and doesn't recognize it. This is stuff that was designed for use in battle. It was designed for use to kill a foreign enemy, to annihilate a foreign enemy, and it's being used on American streets and American neighborhoods. These MRAPs, the landmine-resistant vehicles that the Pentagon has been giving away since the Iraq and Afghanistan wars wound down, the Army last year put out a newsletter cautioning against using MRAPs on domestic military bases because they said they roll over easily, they tear up the roads, and there just isn't much use for them, appropriate use for them on domestic military bases. Now, how is it that they are inappropriate for domestic military bases, but they're perfectly appropriate for Main Street, for use in places like Ferguson, although I'm not sure Ferguson has an MRAP, but they're being used in towns like that all over the country.
MRAPs being mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles. I wanted to put a question to Patricia Bynes, the issue of the police force, because while you may have more peaceful response to the peaceful protesters, you still have the issue of what happened to Michael Brown, also the overwhelmingly white police force in Ferguson. Many of these, a number of the people there may have, those police, been veterans of wars, perhaps occupied foreign lands. Now they're in an overwhelmingly African-American community with their military equipment. What about these longer-term issues?
Well, yesterday I was speaking, and because I've been out there every single day, what I did say is that I've seen things that I understand how the escalation happened. And I even saw an incident where a car came flying down the street and almost plowed through a line of police officers. And the car stopped maybe about 1.5 feet away from where the police officers were. I have seen St. Louis County show an extreme amount of resistance and when it comes to dealing with this issue. So I've seen how the escalation happened, but I've also talked to the officers, and once that car incident happened, I noticed that they did bring out the armored trucks in order to protect themselves in holding what was the line at the time. And one of the officers told me, he said, "Man, we have a couple of vets back here." He said, and that was really scary. That reminded them of what happened in war, and they know that somebody, people in war will drive a truck through the line. So you already have people who have been at war, serving in our communities. So we have to keep public safety and also the officer safety in mind, but we need to have a serious conversation here in the St. Louis area about police tactics and police strategy, and we need to take the best practices that we're currently seeing that are playing out and how to de-escalate a situation.
And finally, Reverend Renita Brown, I'd like to ask you, we've just gotten word that the police will be releasing the name of the officer involved in the shooting at 8 a.m. Your time, 9 a.m. here, East Coast time. Could you respond to that and how that might help also to begin diffusing the situation that has been building up over the last week?
People want to be heard. They want answers. And all that you hear on the street is, tell us his name. Why do you release the names of the criminals? Why do you publish the pictures of the looters but can't show this person's name or face? So I think it will bring a lot of healing to the community to just have a name. The issue of human life and the value of human life is really what the issue is. And when people aren't even given the dignity of answers, and that devalues and dehumanizes them and dehumanizes us. And so I think it'll go a long ways to bring healing to the community.
Well, I want to thank you all for being with us. Reverend Renita Brown, who was hit by a rubber bullet a few nights ago, Patricia Bynes, Democratic Committee woman of Ferguson County, and Radley Balco, author of the book Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Forces, which comes out in paperback later this month, speaking to us from Nashville. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at the whole crisis of Ebola. Stay with us.
Whalers are we. We are whalers. Don't get scared. Nothing happening but out and way out. Nothing happening but the positive, unless you the negative. Whalers, we whalers, yeah, whale, yeah, whalers. We whale, we whale. We could dig Melville on his ship, confronting the huge white mad beast, speeding death across the sea to we. But we whalers, we can kill whales. We can get on top of a whale and whale. Whalers, undersea defense hot folk. Blues babies humming when we arrive. Boogie ladies strumming our black violet souls. Rag daddies come from the land of never say die. Reggae workers bringing the funk to the people of I. We whalers, all right. Hail to you, Bob man. We will ask your question all our lives. Could you be loved? I understand. We see the world. Eyes and eyes say yes to transformation. Whalers, whalers. Subterranean night color magi.
Whalers by the late Amiri Baraka. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the World Health Organization is now saying the number of reported cases and deaths of Ebola in West Africa vastly underestimates the scale of the outbreak. The official death toll from the Ebola outbreak is now at 1,069 since February. Guinea has become the fourth country in Africa to declare a national health emergency as it battles the spread of the deadly Ebola virus in the worst outbreak since the disease was discovered in 1976. The outbreak began in Guinea, where it has killed 377 people. It has since spread to Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, which have all declared a national health emergency.
Last week, the World Health Organization said the unprecedented outbreak of the Ebola virus was an international public health emergency. Ebola's initial flu-like symptoms can lead to external hemorrhaging and internal bleeding, which can lead to organ failure. The disease is highly infectious and can kill up to 90% of those afflicted. Patients have a better chance of survival if they receive early treatment. There's no cure for Ebola, but the first consignment of the experimental drug ZMapp has arrived in Liberia from the U.S. The World Health Organization's approved the distribution of unproven drugs to help address the Ebola outbreak. World Health Organization Assistant Director General Marie-Paul Keeney said the decision was made despite tests that failed to prove the drugs are safe and effective.
The first time we have arranged of potential treatments and vaccines, they could be potent assets supporting our efforts to control Ebola virus disease. However, while several of these treatments have been proven to be very effective in non-human primates, and I mean mostly rhesus macaques, none have undergone the test in humans necessary for licensing as proven safe and effective treatments. That does not mean that they are not safe. It simply means we do not have the evidence from human studies to say that it is certain that they are safe and efficacious.
That was WHO Assistant Director General Marie-Paul Keeney. The outbreak has sparked an international debate over the ethics of giving such untested drugs to the sick and of deciding who should get the drugs.
To talk about the implications of the crisis, we're joined by three guests. Laurie Garrett is with us, Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 1996 for her coverage of an Ebola outbreak in what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. She is the author of two best-selling books, The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, and Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health. In Washington, D.C., we're joined by Lawrence Gaston, University Professor and Faculty Director at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown University, Director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center on Public Health Law and Human Rights. And in Providence, Rhode Island, we're joined by Adia Benton, a medical anthropologist at Brown University. She's conducted research on infectious disease in Sierra Leone over several years. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Laurie Garrett. Laurie, just explain what Ebola is for starters, and then talk about what you think we should understand about it.
Ebola is an RNA virus that infects your endothelial cells, which are the linings of blood cells and vessels, capillaries, puncturing microscopic leaks in them, which grow with time, and you begin to lose all the fluids from your circulatory system into your body as a whole, out of your eyes, out of your nose, out of your mouth, every orifice of the body. Those fluids are filled with virus, and anyone who touches those fluids and then, touches their eye or rubs their nose will become infected. And some of the numbers being tossed around, I heard you say 90% mortality rate. These are gross exaggerations, but it is a truly horrible disease. In only one outbreak did the death toll reach 90%. That was 1976. I was in the 1995 outbreak, which until now was the largest. The current one is more than 3 times larger. And the death toll was closer to 70%. But it's still, my goodness. When you see an average flu in circulation and you think it's a bad flu, you're under 1% mortality rate, to put that in comparison.
And the response, the worldwide response to this outbreak, how do you assess how that has gone so far?
Outrageous. Outrageous. I've been stunned and flabbergasted since March, when this was first reported from Guinea. And I concur completely with the statements made by Médecins Sans Frontières or Doctors Without Borders. They've consistently said, we're the only ones out here, help. Hello, everybody, there's an Ebola epidemic going on. Hello, it's spreading across a border. Oh, it spread another border. What are you all waiting for? I have a piece right now in Foreign Policy that begins, world, you just don't get it. The scale of what we need to be doing versus what we are doing is, log scale differential. All the healthcare workers are burned out. Let's put this in perspective. Excuse me. And there's no water here. Put this in perspective. Before we had an epidemic, these 3 countries had 3 of the worst healthcare systems on the planet and the poorest people on the planet. And not one of those governments was spending more than $100 per capita annually on all forms of health, which in this country keeps a household stocked in aspirin and ibuprofen. And Liberia had about 200 physicians to service 4 million people. About half of those physicians were non-Liberians, foreigners. Ebola struck, a lot of those foreigners left town. They're down now to 50 physicians to deal with everything. Now, as the Ebola crisis gets worse, cardiac patients are going untreated. Women are giving delivery without assistance. You've got automobile accidents with people's legs cut off and nobody will accept them into an ER. It's so much bigger than people realize and that people accept. What we need is hundreds of healthcare workers in these countries immediately. Hundreds. And we're getting dribs and drabs. And we don't need, I know you have a lot of very motivated viewers and listeners. We don't need the do-gooder who's never been out in a crisis before. It's very nice of you to volunteer, but you're not necessary. We need people who have history of working under great trauma, who know how to work in the tropical heat, who know how to maintain personal infection control, and are prepared to deal with some psychologically devastating things.
And the implication of the disease spreading into Nigeria?
Unbelievably important. Now, let's be cautious. At this moment, we have no evidence of secondary transmission. So everybody that's been proven to have Ebola in Nigeria got it directly from this one fellow, Patrick Sawyer, a Liberian businessman who flew for a meeting to Lagos and contaminated people who were part of his entourage and the medical providers who cared for him.
A Liberian-American, right?
A Liberian-American. However, one of the nurses under quarantine, a suspect but not proven case, fled quarantine a couple of days ago, went to the city of Enugu, and now more than 120 people of her contacts are under observation. In addition, at least two of the individuals, one his escort and the other a physician, have died of Ebola in Lagos. The concern, of course, is if it gets beyond that circle, because you cannot ask for a more chaotic city than Lagos, Nigeria. Anybody that's there, has ever been there, knows there's no such thing as a street map for most of the city. Contact tracing, finding, who might have infected who. Oh, my goodness. And on top of it all, they have a national doctor's strike, they have a civil war, and they have a national election, and oh, yes, Boko Haram.
Adia Benton, you have been in Sierra Leone over the years, conducting research on infectious disease there. You're a medical anthropologist at Brown University. Can you share your view on what should be done right now and how we are looking at this issue?
Well, I absolutely agree with Lori Garrett's concerns. We certainly need more health workers on the ground. We need much more protective gear. Many of the health workers that I've been watching on Twitter are curious about how they're going to continue to do their work or how they're going to be protected if they are to head to the front lines. I don't want to underestimate the importance and significance of this disease and of this outbreak. I've been worried about being alarmist but also being able to sound the alarm, because we have to also keep in mind that we don't want people to panic. We want people to do the jobs that need to be done, which is to have an influx of health workers who can actually do the job, who understand how to work in an outbreak situation, and who know how to do infection control. I do have some friends at the CDC who've been deployed, and they're going to be helping with coordinating data efforts, but I haven't heard from nearly as many of my medical friends who are doing the same. So this is something that I think is really fundamentally important. And I think Lori Garrett pointed out, before this outbreak, the health system was woefully inadequate. And it was always perceived to be a place where you go either when you're seriously sick or if you maybe were not, obviously you weren't sure if you were going to live or die. And so for this disease or this outbreak to have overwhelmed the health system, I think has been a serious problem for everyone. I think they're also significant. I think there's right now they're cordoning off Kinema and Kailaun district, which are the hardest hit in Sierra Leone, and that's causing all kinds of other economic and sort of health and political problems. And those are things that we also should be concerned about and concerned with, because that's ultimately going to affect how people on the ground are responding to the response to this outbreak.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Lawrence Gostin of Georgetown, this whole issue of quarantining, and especially large communities, has created quite a bit of controversy on the ground there as well. Could you talk about that? Because you've specialized in trying to look at quarantine efforts.
Yeah, I mean, they have tried to use a cordon sanitaire, which is basically a very large guarded area. But they've used almost a medieval form of quarantine with soldiers, blockades. People who are in the quarantine area are very frightened, and I think deservedly so. And they're frightened not only because they're in a hot spot, a hot zone of Ebola, but also with roads blocked, there's food's expensive and getting scarce. There are no medical supplies, and the basic needs, psychosocial and medical needs, are not being met. And so this is a really inhumane way of trying to do that. We never should have come to this. I think that Ebola is a disease that can be contained if you've got a strong health system, but we've provided no international assistance of the level and sustainability that's needed to build health systems in the world's poorest countries. And this is what happens. And now we have these large quarantine areas. If we did want to do a quarantine, we have to do a smart quarantine, a modern quarantine where we provide humane care, where we give people incentives to stay where they are, psychosocial support, education, nutritious food, medical care, and it's not policed by armed soldiers. The militarization of a disease isn't usually what works. It just causes a lot of fear and panic.
I'm going to have to very much disagree with Larry on this. We're old friends, but Larry, I don't think you're right. Here's why. First of all, I was in the Ebola epidemic in '95, and we, in fact, did do cordon sanitaire. It was the only thing that worked, and it's often ignored. Mobutu was the brutal dictator at the time, and he simply summarily cut the whole region off with soldiers surrounding Kikwit, blocking the highway, no airplanes, etc. The people were stranded, terrified, exactly as Larry is describing. Within that cordon sanitaire district, which enclosed about 500,000 people, individual isolation centers were also set up. And the Red Cross removed every single ailing person from the families, regardless of objections, which sometimes became violent. Many of those Red Cross volunteers themselves contracted Ebola as a result of those altercations. And they would bring them into quarantine hospital facilities. We have no other tool. We don't have anything else. Now, my real problem is, first of all, I agree with Larry, we waited way too long to get to this point. So now it's draconian. And, and secondly, now what's happening de facto is that because the rest of Africa does not believe that Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia are behaving in a competent fashion and doesn't trust that they can stop the epidemic, essentially a de facto cordon sanitaire is around all three countries. They've lost all their trade. Abidjan will no longer ship goods out of the three countries, which pretty much landlocks their trade. They have no more airplane flight landings going on anywhere in the world. So the failure to use the tool of cordon sanitaire strategically early in the epidemic, and now because of the attacks on healthcare workers, in many cases life-threatening, against MSF and other medical providers by angry mobs, yes, you had to have the military come in. You can't ask MSF to keep risking their lives. They're already risking their life to be in front of a virus. And now you're asking them to also put up with people that come in with machetes and guns and try to kill them? No, they need military protection.
We have to break. We're going to come back to this discussion. Okay, Laurie Garrett is the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the Ebola outbreak in now Democratic Republic of Zaire. We're also joined by Georgetown University professor Larry Gostin, as well as Brown medical anthropologist Adia Benton. Stay with us. Abdurrahman. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guests are Adia Benton of Brown University, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Laurie Garrett, and Professor Lawrence Gostin of Georgetown, who also works with the World Health Organization. Professor Gostin, you wanted to respond to Laurie Garrett.
I want to respond because I'm not against cordon sanitaire, but I've talked to the CDC, I've talked to WHO, and I think there is wide agreement that it needs to be smarter. You can't have a health crisis turn into a human rights crisis. You have to provide food, you have to provide medical care, you have to provide psychosocial support, and you need to provide secure but also safe and sterile isolation equipment with personal protection equipment. And that's what a smart sanitaire is. And I don't see that on the ground in those three countries.
Adia Benton, I'd like to ask you also about another issue that's come up, the ethical issue of administering a drug that has really not been fully tested now, and administering it to the populations there in Africa, as the United States is trying to rapidly manufacture this drug. What are some of the ethical questions that it raises for you?
Well, I mean, so we don't actually know the efficacy of the drugs. We don't know the efficacy of the drugs. That's the first piece. But we also aren't sure how much there is and how that system is going to be, how those drugs are going to be disseminated or distributed. I think, as the other two guests have alluded, there is this suspicion and mistrust of certain kinds of interventions. And I think this is applicable to these questions about cordon sanitaire as well, is you really have to understand the local context. You have to understand what the history of experimentation is. You have to understand what the history of intervention is before you can roll these things out. Karen Grappin at NYU has suggested that it might be the perfect opportunity to actually test the efficacy of these drugs, because not everyone can get them. So I think the ethical thing is if you do something, if you administer the drug and people die, then it looks bad. If you don't give it to people and it offers a promise and a hope, it also looks bad. So that's something that people are dealing with right now when they're thinking about the ethical considerations.
The New York Times had a very interesting piece about the leading doctor in Sierra Leone dealing with Ebola, considered a national hero, Dr. Sheikh Umar Khan, who got Ebola. They were weighing whether to give him the ZMapp drug, the very drug that may well have just saved these two American workers who are now at Emory. And the description in the article of the doctors speaking through the night, should we give him this? It hasn't been tested on humans. What if he were to die of a drug we administered, particularly Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, deeply concerned. They decided not to. He died a few days later. And then the optics of it going to two white doctors who were brought back to Emory. Laurie Garrett.
Well, first of all, we don't have any idea if this drug works. I mean, I'm with her all the way on that. And we have an N of 1. One individual who received drug is up and walking around. Another, as far as I know, is still ambulatory. And that one could have been the lucky 30% survivors of Ebola. There's no reason to believe that the drug necessarily is
It's true the Spanish priest got it and died.
The second really big concern is this drug that everybody's talking about, ZMapp, and then there are two other drugs and at least 3 vaccines that are all rushing through processes at the moment. This drug is made in a process that requires that it be in a cold chain all the time until the moment of delivery to the patient. That means you have to have refrigeration every step of the way, temperature controlled. It's a very unstable biological formulation. This isn't a pill. This isn't a simple sera or a simple chemical. And this means that you could have a break in your cold chain and actually do harm to someone. And I worry because, as your guest was saying, this is a region that had the most brutal civil wars back to back that we have seen in modern time. where child soldiers were deployed to go cut off the arms and legs of their own relatives, where the term blood diamonds originated. And, you know, Charles Taylor, the former leader of Liberia, is one of the few truly convicted war criminals now serving time for the horrors that he carried out. So when you hear that people say, you can't go to the hospital because they cut off legs there, or don't go to the hospital because the white people are cannibals, or don't go to the hospital because they will inject you with something that will kill you. These are valid rumors to people. They believe it because they've had a history where all those things actually happened. And everybody has reason to think that, you know, Amy's family has evil spirits to conjure against my family because one of my relatives killed one of her relatives just 10 years ago. And as a result, the idea that you're going to walk in with a dangerous unknown drug, or worse yet, vaccine, and tell people that don't understand germ theory, 50% of whom are illiterate, you know, this is experimental, we're not sure if it'll work, just because I'm injecting it into you doesn't mean you're protected. How many are going to run back and say they're giving us the disease, they're injecting the disease in the hospital? I mean, I think we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of all the possible ramifications of this.
Very quickly, Professor Benton, your response.
I mean, but people want care, right? So the issue with Dr. Khan, for example, he was actually the perfect kind of person to give informed consent. There are people who are sick, nurses, doctors, who can give informed consent. I don't want to underestimate the significance of the war in this, but there are other kinds of things that happened during the war and before the war that engendered this kind of mistrust. So people may be illiterate, but they are also people who wish that their healthcare systems were better and could deliver the level of care that might actually get them through this thing. Unfortunately, they had a health system that was broken before the war and during it and after it. And so this is why I say, that's why especially when you're talking about quarantine, you have to understand the local context. You have to understand, you have to meet people where they are. And there are people who can say, we don't know if this thing works. People use therapies that don't work all the time when they go to traditional healers, but they are looking for something that is efficacious and that will make them better. So this is another piece of the puzzle that absolutely has to be addressed. You have to meet people where they are, and you have to provide them with the best care possible.
Professor Gaston, we have to give you the last word on this issue today.
Well, I mean, I think it's true that, I mean, human beings all have a yearning to be cared for, wherever they are, whatever their experiences are. And so the optics of this was really bad because it went to potentially 3 white foreign aid workers. For me, I would have had ethical criteria in place. I would have given preference to African healthcare workers. I would have gone with consent, and most of all, I would have asked the people involved and the national leaders. This wasn't done transparently. It was behind closed doors. We need to get this out in the open, and we need to involve the communities at risk.
Well, this is a discussion we'll certainly continue to have. Georgetown University professor Lawrence Gaston, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Laurie Garrett, and Brown University professor Adia Benton, thanks so much for being with us. That does it for the show. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feld, Sarah Matte, Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Malkoff, Hani Massoud, Rabbi Karen, Dina Gezer, Amy Littlefield. Special thanks to Julie Crosby and Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.